Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses, and of course, social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. We train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building, and we help leaders craft their own public narrative that tells a story that unites people and moves them to act together. And if you want to act together and create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel pretty daunting. That's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping and guiding clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. And as Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is mauriceblackburn.com.au. And I reckon that's the first time I've done that read without making one mistake. And finally, today's episode is also brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, the lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and of course, text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners, and find out more, just go to their website, swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that's out every Friday that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and people leading them from home and abroad. And abroad we go, not that far though, just across the ditch to New Zealand. We're going to be speaking to Neale Jones, who is the former Chief of Staff to Jacinda Ardern and now runs his own government relations firm. But we've had Neale on a number of times to talk about New Zealand politics. Over the weekend, there was the Labor Party Congress, which is a big meeting, basically. It's similar to a party conference, but they do it in the year of the election, and it's kind of where they bring all their key leaders and activists together and to bring some focus to their leadership as they get closer to the election, which is going to be on the 14th of October this year. This is an election year in New Zealand. They've got a new Prime Minister in Chris Hipkins. He made a key speech on the weekend about not just about the direction of the campaign, but also about himself. We learned a little bit more about who Chris Hipkins is, and Neale will be on the show today to talk about what happened at Party Congress, how things are going in the polls, how the party's faring broadly since they transitioned from Ardern to Hipkins, and how the economy's going as well. We'll talk a bit about that because the budget was dropped earlier in the month. So looking forward to enjoying that conversation with Neale today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast and on Spotify when you're done listening to today's episode, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast and Podchaser. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street, I should say, on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Monday afternoon, back on the lands of the Wurundjeri people back home. And joining me on the line, which seems kind of strange given that I literally was hanging out in his city less than 24 hours ago. Why didn't I do it 24 hours ago as opposed to now? I don't know. But anyway, these are things that happen when we do podcasting. You've known him before because he's been on the show before. He's the former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. He now is the Managing Director for Capital NZ, which is a leading government relations firm based out of Wellington. And it's great to have him back on the show. Neale Jones, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen, and it was good to see you in Wellington.
Indeed. Or should I say kia ora? I've got quite good. I've learned a whole bunch of new Māori words over. I'm not going to try any of them on this podcast, but I feel like I immersed myself over the last 9 days in a bit more local culture, and I feel like I'm a better human being for it.
No, we always appreciate the Australians making an effort, so good on you.
I know. Like I said, I'm not going to try anything because I don't want to destroy what is actually a beautiful sounding language, but nonetheless, we are here. Now, We've got a lot to catch up on. Over the weekend, obviously, the Labor Party had their Congress, which I'm actually going to ask you a bit about the context of that as well. Actually, maybe we'll do that at the start. And the leader, Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, made a key address on the Sunday afternoon, which is a sort of a signature moment of the Congress. Before we get into that, this is my second Congress that I've been to in New Zealand, and I think this is something that we over here in Australia should borrow from you guys. This coming together of the Labor family in the lead up to an election campaign. Tell us about what's the ebb and flow, what it looks like, what's the purpose of it, and how it does vary from a party conference.
Yeah, so in the first 2 years of a term, Labor does a party conference, and that's very policy heavy. It's a lot of remits, a lot of constitutional issues, and people get very fired up on sort of quite obscure policy topics. In the election year, it's a Congress, and it's held a bit earlier. It's held in May rather than November, and it's always held in Wellington, the capital. And that's focused purely on campaigning and getting ready for the campaign. And I really like it because it's about focusing the party's attention and saying, okay, we've had two and a bit years of really focusing on policy and governing. Now we've got to really shift our focus as a party to winning the election. And so you get a whole lot of sessions around training candidates, around things like door knocking, around lots of DVC. It's a really on-the-ground campaign-focused event, and I think it's really healthy. This year there were 500 delegates, which was a huge turnout. And, Labor knows this election is going to be close. It may come down to 10,000 votes. And so when you're that kind of close election, having a good ground game is absolutely critical. So I thought that was a sign of a party in pretty good health.
For those Australians listening to the show, it really is a great weekend. It focuses the minds of the 500 delegates who are effectively the grassroots leadership of the party across the country. It's great information sharing. It's great best practice sharing. There's always little breakout rooms that happen. There's obviously the big conference floor where there's trainings going on there on how to use the database and all the campaign tools. But then there's little breakout rooms that are happening as well, where there are people leading conversations about what the focus is on the campaign, what are the strategy. Like, it's just really, really good. It's a great moment because I think one of the challenges that we do have in political campaigns is we don't tell people what the strategy is. And I've always had the argument, the All Blacks don't go out in a World Cup final where only 3 out of the 15 players know what the strategy is. You're not going to win a game, right, doing that, which one would argue maybe that's what the Wallabies has been doing for the last 15 years. But, you can't win a game doing that. And I just think that we need to be sharing with everyone what our strategy is. It doesn't matter if the Tories find out, because they're not going to do much about it, right? It's our strategy and we're just going to implement it. And I just think that this weekend was a great way of doing that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, sometimes in politics, whether it's campaigning on the ground or whether it's, your political strategy, so often people have this idea that strategy should be kept tight in the leadership and at the top, and we can't let everyone know because what if they find out? Well, so what if they find out? I mean, so what if our opponents find out that Labor's going to knock on lots of doors? Then we're going to target persuadable voters, and we're going to get out people we can mobilise, and we're going to talk about the cost of living and why Labor's the party you can trust. I mean, really?
Yeah. I know, I'm the same. I always felt, and certainly in the field program here in Victoria, we actually we had strategic briefings with all of our volunteer leaders, like weekly phone hookups, and we actually had people leadership from the campaign come on and tell them what was going on. Good luck if you want to try and organise that. That's not that easy to do. So if our opponents find out about it, then mazel tov to them. Anyway, so it was a great weekend. I love it. And obviously on the final day, the PM, the leader of the Labor Party, gets up and gives this keynote speech. What did you take from the address by Chris Hipkins to the party faithful?
Yeah, look, I mean, he sort of, I think there were 3 things he did there. The first was he did a really robust defence of Labor's record. And that's important because Labor actually does have a good record to defend in government over the last 5.5 years, but often hasn't been very good at talking about that record, and has allowed the opposition to frame it up as having not delivered or being focused on the wrong things. And his Congress policy he announced was about extending the apprenticeship boost scheme, which is a scheme where basically the government pays employers to take on apprentices. And it's been a big success, huge increase in apprentices, huge increase of women, Pacifica, Māori, young people going into apprenticeships. And he was able to talk about that success and then extending that program. So I thought that was really good, defending that record. The second thing was telling a bit more about himself, because, he's still in that early stage as a as a leader and as a Prime Minister, where people need to get to know who he is. And he gave, I thought, a really good rundown of his background, his parents, how they raised him, what they did, and, quite, lower middle class, very sort of common upbringing in New Zealand. And I think it was a way to communicate to the public that the concerns and the challenges they face around cost of living at the moment, that he's grounded in that experience, that he knows what it's like. He didn't come from privilege. He doesn't claim to have come from dire poverty. He's just had a very regular lower middle class upbringing. And I think the third thing he did, which was really important, was really, and they did this across the conference, was to elevate that contrast with National. One of the things National wants to tell people this election is that you can have all these big tax cuts and there's no consequence. It's just free money and they'll get rid of waste and everything will be fine. It'll be just like now, but with more money in your pocket. Yeah. And he was able to say, actually, you know what? There is a risk here. If you elect National, they will cut things that you care about and you rely on and your communities rely on. And I thought it was interesting, the Saturday announcement, so the sort of the day that's not the big media day, the Deputy Prime Minister, Carmel Cipollone, announced Labour would maintain the superannuation eligibility age at 65, which, by itself as a policy, you think, well, is that really a policy? You're just announcing that you're going to keep something you've already committed to. But what it did was it forced National to come out and have a go, which had a whole day of stories about how National was going to raise the age to 67. And so it actually drew National out on some of its negative policies. So I thought elevating that contrast in a close election, I think, was really important.
And I'm assuming we're seeing the framing of what we do think that what the positive key message or tone will be from the Labor campaign heading up to the elections, which is on the 14th of October for those unfamiliar, but also how they're going to contrast that with National, with the Conservatives, around even the words cuts have started to appear in a lot of language being used. I mean, is that obviously there's I guess the research is probably telling them that there is a concern if this is going to be tell me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like this election is going to be a cost of living election. If it's going to be a cost of living election, people are going to be worried about cuts, right?
Well, exactly. So, cost of living in all the polling is the number one issue by far. And anyone who gets out and talks to anyone tells you that's the issue. And so, like I say, National's answer, as always, is tax cuts. And those tax cuts inevitably favour the wealthy. And so someone on the minimum wage gets about $2 a week, while someone on higher incomes gets thousands of dollars every year. And they pay for that by cuts. And at the same time we have a cost of living crisis, we also have significant need in our health system post-COVID, our education system, just keeping up with cost pressures. And so one of the things Labor's going to have to do is, as well as talking about what they're going to do on cost of living, sort of making the point that with National, they're not actually going to benefit you, they're going to benefit the wealthy. And to pay for that, they're going to cut things that you care about. And so Labor's got this language now of the coalition of cuts, which is drawing National and ACT, their kind of right-wing libertarian coalition partner, together and saying these two parties, their agenda is to cut, and being really simple and repetitive on it, which is, we both know, is the key to any successful messaging.
It also, there was some, when I was over in Wellington during the week, reading a lot of the commentary in the newspapers were talking about, since Hipkins has taken over the leadership from Ardern, that Labor has been very active in trying to set the agenda on a whole various parts of campaign policy, and in doing so, it's kind of put National on the back foot a little bit and having to be a bit reactionary. And in doing so, we've actually started to see a little bit of division within the National caucus. I want to get to the relationship between National and ACT in a moment, but there was some inconsistencies coming out from the National leader, Luxon, on medium density housing that wasn't in line with what the policy was. Are we starting to see some sort of fraying at the edges of this opposition?
Yeah, and look, part of Hipkins' successful transition of the leadership, and when Jacinda Ardern resigned and Hipkins stepped up, the National Party thought they were home and hosed. They thought, that's it, we've won. And they found with Hipkins' successful repositioning of Labour to being bread and butter issues, cost of living, sort of family budget focus, he's kind of taken, cost of living had been their issue, and he'd sort of taken that front and centre as his issue. And so they've kind of struggled a bit. And while their polling's, doing okay, you would expect them to do much better than they are. I mean, if you look at the right track, wrong track polling, it's, wrong track has overtaken right track. The last 2 times that happened or got close were change elections in New Zealand. Economic confidence figures are, through the floor. Mm. On those fundamentals, Nationals should be romping home to a historic victory, and they're just not. They're neck and neck with Labour on a good day. And I think that there has made a lot of people question Luxon's leadership, question his judgment, question his likability. And I mean, that example that you mentioned where they had with Labour under the previous leadership, his deputy leader actually, and the previous leader had agreed to a bipartisan housing density agreement around medium density housing in residential areas. And he had, at a public meeting, came under pressure and announced a change of policy. And they kind of sounded like they'd been doing some work around this stuff, but they had to scramble to fix it up. And that was an example, I think, of Luxon being inexperienced. He's very new in the job. People forget he's a first-term MP. I've heard stories from journalists about how he'll say something, they think they've got a story, and a press secretary runs down to their car and knocks on their window and says, oh, actually, that's not what he meant. Mm. And in the heat of an election campaign, he can't afford to make mistakes like that, because you get a bit of leeway when outside the election campaign, but in the heat of it, that becomes a big story.
I do wonder if the Labor campaign will factor that into their strategy in trying, because, I mean, as you said, campaigns are long and they're tiring, and when people get tired, they make mistakes. And I'm just wondering if there are ways in which they can draw Luxon out a lot more into the media, testing their policies, putting me under pressure, hell of a lot more engagement. I understand that the debates certainly mean a lot more in New Zealand than they do in, say, in Australia, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that. But creating a scenario upon which Luxon is tested, and maybe even having a longer campaign. I don't know how it works in New Zealand, but when you sort of declare it's an official campaign, but I've always viewed to start the campaign. When you want to start the campaign, just don't. You know what I mean?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're right. I think he needs to be put under pressure. I wouldn't underestimate him. I remember when Labor underestimated John Key in 2008, thought he'd be a pushover, thought Helen Clark would wipe him out in the debates, and got a nasty surprise. So, Luxon does work hard. He's very committed. He's relentlessly on message, in fact, to a fault, dare I say. But I think you're right. I think you've just got to run a hard campaign. You've got to throw issues at him. You've got to drag it out if you can and try and put him under pressure so he makes mistakes. And Chris Hipkins, is a very seasoned politician. He doesn't tend to make those sort of silly mistakes. He's been there, he's done that, and he knows what he's doing.
Where is there opportunity for the Labor Party to expose the relationship between National and their coalition partners? Because obviously elections are always one in the centre. And I get a feeling that some of the caucus members or the policies of ACT may not align with mainstream Kiwis. Is there an opportunity there to start to fray that coalition apart a bit?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one of the challenges National's got right now is they're losing votes to the right. So that's actually leading them, I think, to make a bunch of decisions that are dragging them away from the centre. So that's helpful, and that's happening by itself. Right. I think part of what Labor needs to do, and they're starting to do that, is to make clear what ACT's policies are. I know this sounds bizarre, but David Seymour, their leader, is quite a kind of funny, jovial guy. He's on the news with a quip, bit of a smile on his face. Most people who vote ACT, they're polling around 10% right now, don't actually know what their policies are. I think most New Zealanders don't know what their policies are. And they're actually pretty right-wing. They would basically gut the welfare state. They would slash taxes for the wealthy, and they would set back race relations in New Zealand by a generation or more. And I think what they need to do, and they are doing, is package up National and ACT's policies and say, here's what that might look like. I mean, ACT, given their polling, in National's polling, they could have a quarter of the seats in Cabinet. So you can legitimately say, which, Labor did over the weekend, they said National's going to cut superannuation by extending the age for 2 years. That's going to cost $50,000. Plus, ACT's going to reduce or remove employer contributions. That's another $50,000. So $100,000 between them they're going to cut from your retirement. And let National deny it. Let National say, oh, no, we wouldn't do that. But in the past, Nationals had no qualms about attaching the Green Party's policies to Labor. I think Labor needs to aggressively attach the ACT Party's policies to National and let National deny it.
Absolutely. I would be exposing that relentlessly for the next
And you see that in Labour's messaging about the coalition of cuts. They're not just saying National's going to cut, they're saying this is a coalition that's going to cut.
Yeah. I don't want to spend the whole podcast shitting on the Conservative side of politics, but...
no, that's a pity.
Yeah, I know. No, we're going to do more of these, so we'll have plenty of opportunity when we get closer to the campaign. I am interested to get a sense from how you've seen... I mean, you came on the show in early February after the change in leadership, and I just want to get a sense from you about how you've observed Hipkins in that time as leader, and what changes are we starting to see, maybe subtle or maybe a bit more obvious, from transition from the leadership of Jacinda Ardern?
Yeah, so look, it's always hard when you take over as a leader from someone like Jacinda Ardern, who was such a major figure in New Zealand politics. And, you know, it's also hard to be able to not just be seen as kind of a continuity candidate when you've got a public mood which is kind of, you know, grumpy about the cost of living crisis, concerned about the economy, and there's various grumbles and gripes that have built up over sort of the 5.5 years that preceded you. So you've got to be able to show a sort of a new face, and I think Hipkins was able to pivot very well. He pivoted quite hard in a way that respected Ardern's legacy, but showed that he is someone who is new in a different time where cost of living is the pressure, and that he had his own priorities. And so one of the first things he did was what he called his policy bonfire, where he, in a couple of tranches, got a bunch of Ardern-era policies that were underway, some of them controversial, sort of bogged down, some of them just, you know, people sort of thought weren't a priority. And he said, you know, things like the income insurance scheme, the TVNZ-RNZ merger, the bill to reduce the voting age to 16. And he just got rid of them and said, you know what, these things are worthy. I like them, I agree with them, but it's just not a priority right now. My focus is, you know, I'm laser focused on the cost of living and your family budgets. And I think that gave voters a very clear early indication that he wasn't distracted by other issues. He was the cost of living guy. He also, you know, I think his personality has been right for the time. He's someone who is kind of a dad who dresses a bit daggy. He's, you know, you'd see him, you bump into him at Bunnings, or you'd bump into him on the try line at the kids' rugby. That's kind of the persona he gives. You know, a national voting family member of mine described him as just a dad who you might know, which I think is, you know, more workmanlike, more practical. It's just a very sort of, I think, right leadership for the times. So I think he's done that well. He's also, you know, you might have seen the sort of sausage roll thing. I don't know if that's made it to Australia, but everywhere he goes, sort of, it's known that he likes sausage rolls. And so, you know, he goes to see Rishi Sunak, he goes to see the King of England, and he gets fed sausage rolls, and that becomes a meme. The funny thing is, it's not actually just a meme, it is a meme, but also, I mean, he is chemically dependent on sausage rolls. If he hasn't had a sausage roll by 10:30 a.m, he sends his staff down to Copperfields to get them for him, because he gets grumpy without them. You know, that he's a sausage rolls and Coke Zero kind of guy. And I think that sort of, that image and that meme has sort of helped communicate who he is and the kind of leadership that he seeks to provide. And that I think gives a real contrast to Christopher Luxon, Nationals leader. You know, Luxon very much presents as the corporate business guy, you know, Unilever Air New Zealand CEO. That's his persona. And in an economic crisis, you know, cost of living crisis, an economy that's sort of turning down a bit, you do risk voters saying, well, I might not like everything about this guy on National, but he understands business, so I'm going to back him. And that's how, you know, John Key in 2008 made a lot of money. He was a money trader. People said he's a businessman. He's the guy we need. I think Hipkins' alternative is to say, actually, in a cost of living crisis, rather than the CEO who looks out for the wealthy, how about the family guy from Middle New Zealand who understands, you know, who understands you and is grounded in your experience and your values? How about you trust that guy in Labour to get you through this time? And Labour's betting that's the more appealing proposition.
It's interesting. There's a whole bunch of things I want to unpack there. One of them, the first one, maybe just a reflection. Did he actually call it a bonfire policy? What was the term you used?
Policy bonfire.
Policy. Did he say that himself?
I can't remember if it was him or the media, but it's become known as the policy bonfire.
That's brutal. I love it.
But I mean, this is the thing, though. It was a very deliberate communication strategy. It wasn't just quietly and embarrassed getting rid of some stuff. He put it up in lights and stood in front of held a press conference and said, "Today I'm announcing these policies will go," and had a whole list of policies.
And what was the response from the public?
Really positive. I mean, I think the thing is, most of these policies were not beloved by the public, nor were they hated by the public. They were just things that sort of seemed to be worthy, but kind of bogged down in controversy, some of them. And some of them just sort of seemed, people were sort of going, why is Labour focused on that? You know, I can't afford to fill up my car. I can't pay my grocery bills. And you're worried about this thing, which seems nice, but not really that important right now.
Yeah.
So it was about priorities.
I think you and I have spoken about this over a beer before. I think the Achilles heel of social democratic parties around the world is when they start prioritising policies that are cute and cuddly, but actually aren't going to, change votes. No disrespect to those policies and who they'll help, but it's still, it's not going to win elections.
And the risk in a cost of living crisis is if National's talking about tax cuts and Labour's talking about reducing the voting age or merging TVNZ and Radio New Zealand.
Yeah, please.
When the cost of living crisis, people go to that person.
Yeah. Who is Labor worried about then? I mean, obviously, you'd like to, but I guess the expectations aren't that they're going to turn out everyone that voted for Labor in the 2020 COVID election all around again. But where are they? And I hate playing demography bingo, but who are the key demographics that Labor's worried about in terms of the starting to take a look at another party and think, I'll give them a go?
Look, I think one of the key things for Labour is women. Women tend to vote Labour more than National, but they need to hold the Jacinda Ardern women voters and they need to win them across. And so that is, you would have seen in the budget, there was a big focus on women. And so there was the free early childhood education for 2-year-olds, which previously just been 3-year-olds. There was the, removing prescription fees, which, as well as women going to the pharmacy more, even things like getting the pill as a prescription. So there was a real focus there on women, and that's a big focus. The other thing they'll be concerned about is Māori, making sure they keep their Māori vote up. The Māori Party is making quite a big run at Labour in the Māori seats. Now, an MMP, if they pick up a couple of seats, that's not the end of the world for Labour, but they don't want to see a collapse in their Māori vote. So, that's another area where I think you're going to see a bit of a focus this election.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. It's funny you mentioned those two groups, actually, because they're the ones that I wouldn't have thought comes to front of mind. But certainly looking at what was announced in the budget, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. But when I was going to say as well, South Auckland's a big focus for Labour. So Auckland in general, a third of the population lives in Auckland, so that's a focus. But South Auckland, where there's a higher than a disproportionate number of Māori, Pacifica, and low-income people who are core Labour vote, but who statistically aren't as likely, are a bit more patchy in their voting records. I think Labour's going to really have to do a turnout job there, and part of that's about making sure the stakes this election are clear.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, I want to pick on that point in a moment. One thing I've taken as an outsider in looking at some of the media commentary about where Labor is struggling, they're framing it up as if it's sort of middle class men who are in that kind of, I guess, what I'd call Gen Xers nowadays. Got people in the families, fathers, kids, family 4 or 5, couple of jobs, doing some work either in sort of unskilled areas or maybe even in trades areas. A lot of the Vox Pop stories that have been running have been focused on these people, and I was pissed off with Jacinda for all these different reasons.
Yeah, look, I think, obviously, sort of what's called Middle New Zealand is the key in the election, so that sort of goes without saying. But I mean, Labor has had struggled with men compared to women for a long time. It's quite striking when you see the gender breakdown of the vote. So that's kind of a long run issue for Labor. I think Chris Hipkins does have the potential to pull some men across. I've talked to a couple of guys I know who used to be quite, they got quite filthy on Jacinda for a while. They really didn't like her. And, could be misogyny, some of this, probably is. But they saw Chris Hipkins and they liked him. They thought, this guy's okay. So he might pull some men across, but this is probably a big long run issue that I'm not qualified to opine on.
Well, it's just interesting the way that media, some elements of the media are framing it up as opposed to what we're seeing coming from the party. And I guess that what we're seeing coming from the party is a greater indication about where they're going to focus their energies.
I guess, yeah. And look, I mean, there may be more to it, but I think Labor probably sees that those women who they won in 2020 and they want to keep, and who backed Jacinda in 2017, that they're the ones who are the most persuadable. Yeah,
interesting. Labor had a defection at the start of the month. A Labor minister, in fact, it wasn't even just a backbencher, and he's going to test my ability to pronounce names. Meka Faitiri, is that right? Did I get that right?
B-.
Do you want to give it a go?
Meka Faitiri.
Yeah, the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I stuffed that up. Anyway, that caught everyone by surprise. Obviously, I mean, certainly reading the reports of the media, I don't think anyone saw this coming. Two questions. One, why didn't anyone see this coming? And two, why has she defected and gone and joined the Māori Party?
Yeah, so this was a weird one because defections in Parliament aren't unheard of, but for a sitting minister to defect from, cabinet minister, or not cabinet, sorry, a member of the executive though, to defect and join another party, that's pretty unheard of. And the other thing I'd say is normally when an MP defects from a party, you kind of see it coming. Like, you hear things, you hear people grumbling, you hear just around Wellington, this MP's not happy and all that kind of thing. The media are briefed that they're not happy and sort of things start to rumble. And eventually it breaks out and everyone goes, yeah, I saw that coming. Literally no one saw Meka Faitiri leaving ahead of time. It just happened. She didn't even tell her party what was going on. They found out because of the rumour mill, basically. Because the marae had been booked in Hawke's Bay, which was making the announcement, and that word started to leak out. The Prime Minister has still yet to receive a call back from her. He's called her, she hasn't responded. She didn't even talk to the leader. I mean, if you're 16 years old and you quit your job at McDonald's, you at least ring your boss to tell him you're leaving. But she didn't even respond. As far as anyone can tell, she hadn't been unhappy about the party's policy or direction. The only thing that appears to have any sense to it is she was unhappy she wasn't elevated from being a minister outside of cabinet into cabinet in the last couple of reshuffles, and seemed to be, hold a grudge about that. And the speculation is that kind of led her to look elsewhere, to the Māori Party. Look, only she will know that, and she's been very vague when asked about it. She's just sort of said, I've followed my heart and I've gone home to the Māori Party and all this. But no one really believes that. It's an odd one.
So there's something else perhaps beneath the surface that we're not getting a full account of.
On the evidence, I suspect it was just disgruntlement at lack of promotion and a sense of having an opportunity elsewhere. That might be unfair, but I've seen nothing else to suggest anything otherwise. Certainly, I haven't heard any coherent, principled explanation as to why she's left. When the Māori Party was created after the foreshore and seabed controversy in the 2000s, I mean, their view was that the Labour government had confiscated the foreshore and seabed and that this was a breach of Māori rights. They could not stay in the party. And wherever you fall in that debate, you can understand if someone feels that and they feel they have to leave, there's a reason behind that and people can respect that. I've never heard anything like that from Meka Faitiri, so it's very odd.
Interesting. The Greens, you mentioned earlier in your remarks about some issues within the Greens party. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so, the Greens have had a bit of a fractious time lately. The membership, a faction of the membership at one point rolled their leader, James Shaw. Didn't get a majority, but according to their rules, they created a vacancy, and he was rolled as Green Party leader for a couple of months. there's been ongoing sort of disputes internally, and more recently, Elizabeth Kerekere, one of their MPs from the Green Left, sent a text message accusing another MP of being a crybaby and complaining about her bill getting up because it wasn't going to help her in selections. And that was unfortunately sent to the Green Party's caucus chat group, which did not go down well. And the Green Party announced an investigation into it, and then a whole lot of other allegations came up around bullying and bad treatment of staff and so forth. And that investigation went on, and eventually Elizabeth Kerekere just said, I'm out, and she pulled out of the Green Party. She's now an independent MP. And between that and the Mika Whaitiri resignation, that did give National opportunity to paint Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori as the coalition of chaos. And they're working very hard to reanimate this idea that if you vote for the left, you're going to have chaos and disruption and not a stable government. And I mean, I don't know about Australia, you've had a bit of a bad run in recent times on this stuff, but in New Zealand, instability in government is seen as basically fatal. The view is if you can't run your party, you can't run the country. And voters take a very dim view of that, to the point that National and government, whenever they ran their election ads, their attack ads on the opposition were always various iterations of a group of people disorganised, not getting on. There was the famous rowing race one where National was a sleek machine rowing fast, and Labour and the Greens and other parties were in a dinghy sort of paddling against each other. And so I think that is a risk for Labour and the Greens, and they need to keep it tight to the election because they can't afford any more distractions.
To your point, I mean, yeah, we've definitely had challenges internally within our own party system whilst in government. But I think the experience here in Victoria, anyway, was seen as Daniel Andrews has been able to front foot those issues and front foot it quickly and deal with it quickly and kind of do the only I can actually fix these problems. I'm the protagonist in this and they're the antagonist, and I'm with you on this one. But I guess it's a bit different when you're trying to form a coalition with another party, because Chris Hipkins can't come out there and say, I'm going to sort the Greens out because it's not his organisation, which is an interesting point you raised, because I think it's important for Australian listeners to understand the because of MMP, it's rare for any party to win outright. So therefore, it is designed to have coalition building to form government. So therefore, the expectation going to this next poll is that Labor will have to form a coalition, most likely with the two parties you just mentioned, the Māori Party and the Greens Party. Just talk us through a bit about that and how that relationship works.
Yeah, so I mean, this majority Labor government is a historical aberration. It's the only time in an MMP that's ever happened, and that was because of the COVID response and that sense of national crisis. MMP was a system designed for the Germans after World War II to stop any one party from having too much power. And we sort of imposed it on ourselves after a series of pretty bad neoliberal governments in the 80s and 90s who had minority support and rammed through a whole lot of unpopular policies. So what that means is generally you'll have one major party, Labour or National, and they'll have a series of governing arrangements with other parties to form a majority. And that can be as much as a formal coalition agreement where you're working together as a coalition. You have the other party has seats in cabinet, and you're essentially fronting as one, through to a confidence and supply agreement, which is where you just sort of say, you'll vote for our budget, you'll vote for us in confidence votes, and you get a few policies and maybe a minister outside cabinet, right down to what they have now, what Labor has now with the Greens, which is a cooperation agreement, which is a very thin agreement with a few sort of policy areas. There's even talk about Te Pāti Māori has said they're considering just sitting on the crossbenches and just saying, well, you can govern as a minority government and we'll just vote for you if we feel like it, but you'll have to come to us on every piece of legislation, which would be quite a departure for New Zealand. It would be quite an unstable government, I would imagine. So that's that, but that needs to sort of form coalitions and governing agreements means that a minor party's actions and policies impact on the major party. So, like we said before, Labor is going to have fun with National by pointing to ACT's extreme policies. Last election, the Greens were promising a controversial wealth tax. National spent a long time trying to say Labor would put in a wealth tax because the Greens would make them. That actually backfired because people said, well, we better give Labor a majority then, so the Greens don't have any influence. But yeah, that means policy and stability and personalities of the minor parties actually have a big impact on the fortunes of major parties. And if the Greens implode, that has bad consequences for Labor.
So we had a poll come out whilst I was over there during the week on a poll that was dropped by one of your TV stations, TV1, was it? Which kind of looks
TVNZ,
TV1. And I don't know if you've got the numbers in front of you there, but just want to share them with the viewers and tell me your thoughts on it. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, that was Labor 35, National 37, Greens 7, ACT 11, and Te Pāti Māori 2.4. That gave National a lead of 2. The last couple of polls from reputable agencies had kind of had, well, the last few have basically been Labor or National, one or the other ahead. And there's about sort of 0.5 to 2 points in at any one time between the blocks. I think that just I wouldn't focus too much on any one poll. I mean, the TV networks sort of, when a poll comes out showing National ahead by 1 or Labor ahead by 2, it's a big headline about who would govern. This is margin of error stuff. I think what we do know on the long run is Labor and the Greens and maybe Te Pāti Māori are about level with National and ACT. And it'll come down to sort of 1 or 2%. And, there's everything to fight for in this election campaign. The other thing I would say is the leadership polling is also interesting, and that's what gives me some hope as a Labor person, which is, Christopher Luxon's favourability is down at -7%, his net favourability. Hipkins is at +22 net favourability. That suggests, if you're going into a campaign relatively level pegging, that says to me that leadership will be on Labor's side. And in the preferred PM, Hipkins is about 10 points ahead as well.
That's interesting. And it was the poll that was done just coming out of you guys had your budget announced or dropped or read or whatever the hell we call it during the week. And they were saying that this was sort of the first big poll after the budget. And because there was like a couple of points swing to National, they were making out that this was a rejection of the budget. But I understand that the survey actually began on budget night itself, so it's not really sort of fair to say that. But I want to get your thoughts about how this plays into the budget.
There's a myth in New Zealand that there's this thing called the budget bounce, and every year the political journalists say, will they get a budget bounce? Actually, the data doesn't show that governments get a budget bounce. Most people aren't so connected to, back when I was a kid, I remember the budget night, there were only 2 or 3 channels, and every channel played the budget, and it was at night time, and everyone had to watch it, and it was a big deal. And they put the cost of smokes up, and everyone ran up the dairy and all that kind of stuff. That's not how it works anymore. The budgets are read at 2 p.m. Very few people pay much attention to it. It's not the big news day it once was. Our media environment's so fragmented. 18 to 24-year-olds are more likely to be looking at TikTok than the TV news. So these things do, the initiatives in the budget do make a difference over time, but I think, people aren't sitting there waiting with bated breath to find out what Grant Robertson has to say, unfortunately.
And I think back in those days when you said it wasn't all the TV channels, I reckon you were just watching it because you're a political nerd, and these were the early days.
No, I was a child desperate to watch something else, and my mum would be sitting there watching the budget.
But for the work you do today.
Yeah, but the budget, the good news actually I found out of the budget in terms of the election, which is probably more significant than any initiatives announced, was the economic forecast. So, inflation in New Zealand's 6.7% right now. It's forecasted to be down in the 1 to 3% target range by the second half of next year. So that's quite a rapid drop from here on out. New Zealand was forecast to go into recession. Treasury is now saying it won't. Now that's a Treasury forecast, but that's good news. And unemployment, it's going to edge up to about 5%, but not as bad as we thought it might be. So, I think heading to the election, if those figures maintain, rather than a bad economic news story, Labor's going to be able to say, look, we've had a global cost of living crisis, but our policy measures and our strong economic management has seen inflation coming down fast and has seen us avoid recession. And I think that would be a very strong platform to go into the election with.
Yeah, I read during the week that there was sort of 2 narratives being spun out of the budget. There was what Treasury was forecasting, not just Grant Robertson, the the finance minister, but what Treasury was saying in terms of it was reasonably optimistic. But a lot of the economic commentators were going, "No, that's garbage. We don't think that's true at all."
And it may be. It may be, but I don't know. All you can do is go off the Treasury figures, and if those are the figures, then that's good news. The other thing that could have been bad for the government is interest rates. So the government had a real test there in the budget. If they spent too much and risked stoking inflationary pressure, and the Reserve Bank the next week was coming out with this interest rate decision, if the government was seen to have pushed up interest rates even further, that would have been quite damaging, I think. This budget itself was expansionary. The out years are going to be deflationary as the economy as the government spending sort of comes down from the COVID peak. But the Reserve Bank met last week, and rather than raising it 50 basis points, they raised it 25, which was what they had predicted to do. Yeah. And they said this is the last increase we're planning, and the budget was a friend to the Reserve Bank, not an enemy. So it kind of deflated National's attack that the government was going to be pushing up interest rates.
What kind of restraints would that then put on the government in wanting to allocate financial resources into policy announcements that are targeted to middle income earners that are feeling the pressures of the cost of living, but not be inflationary? And how much cash does the government have right now to do those kind of things? I don't know if you're an economist. If you don't know the answer to those things, I got asked a question like that on ABC Radio a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, mate, what are you asking me that for? I wouldn't have a clue. So by all means, have a stab at it, but I just want to get a sense of that. How does the party thread the needle on that one?
Look, it is hard because if you were just looking at this as a cost of living crisis, as Labor, you'd do a massive tax package. You'd look at the low income people, that bottom tax bracket, and you just pile money into low middle income families. And you'd contrast that with National and say National's giving up to the top, we're giving to the bottom and middle, and I think you'd be home and hosed. The problem they're going to have is they've got a few pressures. One is if they spend too much, they seem to be stoking inflation, and that's not going to be popular. They are limited in terms of tax packages because they need to fund health and education and other social services. And so I think you're going to see not the big spending budgets you might have seen in the past. I think you're going to see a more modest campaign. And actually, I think they're going to put the focus back on National and put the challenge to them and say, can you explain how you're going to pay for these tax cuts, how you're going to fund health and education, how you're going to avoid being inflationary, and how you're actually going to pay for all this without cutting services. And I think that pushing back on National is some of the offence will provide some of the defence.
It's going to be an interesting 140 or 139 days left until the poll. But certainly since we last spoke, I feel like Labor is they've bedded down and made some good foundations to set themselves up for some electoral success come October. I want to get your sort of final reflections before we wrap up.
Yeah, look, I think Labor has a clear strategy around cost of living, around the choiceless election between Labor and National. I think the leadership is well placed. Chris Hipkins is seen as honest and in touch, and his preferred PM is looking good. And I think they're starting to frame up National in a way I haven't seen Labor do for a long time. For a long time, Labor sort of said, we'll ignore National. During the height of Jacinda Ardern, sort of Jacinda media, they said, we'll ignore National and we'll just talk about us. Well, you can't do that when you're pushing for a third term. So that contrast is firming up as well. So, I would just say if you look, like I said at the start, if you looked at the fundamentals of right track, wrong track, the economy, this is an election where an incumbent would have a very hard job. But I think between the sort of the campaign strategy and strengths Labor's built up, and that contrast with National exploiting their weaknesses, I think Labor has a very good chance of keeping office in October this year.
Fantastic. Neale, once again, we always thank you for coming on the show and giving us your insights into New Zealand politics. When I was over at the Party Congress on the weekend, I ran into a bunch of folks who listened to the show. And I did say to them that we're going to do, in the final month leading up to Election Day, we're going to do a weekly show unpacking the campaign. So I'm hoping, Neale, you'll be able to join us in that journey. But until then, best of luck with all the work you do outside of coming on this podcast, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.